What's going on, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Book Binge this week for episode 63. I'm going to go ahead and warn you ahead of time in this video, as well as for several more videos to come. I mentioned in my Fortnite on the Isle that would have come out just over a week ago at this point that I'd gotten a little bit sick last week. I'm doing fine this week, so my voice isn't really strained or hurting or anything like that anymore. My voice is practically recovered. The only issue is that my nasty, nasty cough that I get pretty much every single time I get any form of sick over the last few years has returned with the sickness. So if there are more cuts than normal, either in this video or in pretty much any of the videos to come over the next 2 months, quite frankly, because over the next week or week and a half, I'm going to be recording a lot of videos ahead of time. That is why. It's because I have to, make a quick cut so that I can clear my throat or cough or clear my sinuses or what have you. There's a little bit of congestion as well. So I apologize for the inconvenience on that front. But this week, what are we actually going to be talking about? Well, this is the first time that I've covered this book in a non-spoiler fashion because it is not the first time that I've covered this book on the channel, that being Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. Obviously, and I will also clarify that the version that I'm specifically reviewing is the 1818 text. The edition that I have here contains both the 1818 original version as well as the revised 1831 version, but I'm reviewing the 1818 version, the original one, because that is the one that I read about a year ago, a little over a year ago now at the time that I'm recording this, which feels really weird to say. That was quite a bit ago. But with that being said, this time the review is spoiler free and it's more along the lines of my regular reviews, just as you might have expected, because this one's with my face cam, it's not scripted. Whereas the first time that I covered this video, nearly a year ago, was scripted and was a little bit more spoilery and was a little bit more in depth. The reason that I'm not redoing that video like I had planned to is because I feel like it's time to actually start covering some more of these classic novels that I've been reading over the last year on the Book Binge rather than just relegating them to their own thing. Count the Classics, a series that I have not done a very good job of continuing. It's a very series that I've been neglecting a lot, which I heavily regret. But with that being said, I did want to cover this book as well as all of the other classics I've been reading on the Book Binge. So this video is starting that, and I will, over the course of the next several months, be slowly working in normal Book Binge reviews for all of the other classics I've also read recently. So let's just start off this video just like normal with the good things that I really enjoyed about Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. I think the very first thing that I'll talk about here is rather stand out in general. The tone and the atmosphere of Frankenstein is fantastic and incredibly memorable. One of the most memorable aspects of the book, if we're talking about aspects of the book rather than just scenes. For example, this book is known as a precursor and kind of an early inception of Gothic fiction, generally Gothic horror as well, a bit more specifically. And that is absolutely true for sure. It oozes this tone and this atmosphere quite well. One of the other things that I liked a lot about Frankenstein is that the framing mechanism for the book is very fun. The first few chapters, I suppose you could call them, I'm going to double check and see if that's what they actually are. Um, yeah, the first few quote unquote chapters of the book are actually a handful of sections called letters, because the framing device used for this story is essentially a man on a expedition in, I believe it's the Arctic, if I'm not mistaken, comes across the character of Victor Frankenstein and is writing letters to his sister, I believe. Sorry, it's been a little bit since I've read this, so I don't remember the details. But a man basically picks up a man called Victor Frankenstein. He's on an expedition in the Arctic. Victor Frankenstein tells him his story of why he's in the Arctic, essentially. And this man who is speaking with Victor is writing letters of the story to his sister. So that's a framing device. So these first few chapters of the book are letters prefacing that fact. The atmosphere of this section specifically is very good. I liken it to the story Endurance, Shackleton's Incredible Voyage by Alfred Lansing. If you really enjoyed the beginning of this book, these first few chapters especially, you would almost certainly really like the tone and atmosphere of Endurance. If you really liked Endurance, you'd at least really like the opening to this book. But that's all besides the point. That's basically how it's framed. You pick up this guy, and then when the actual narrative starts, it's essentially Victor Frankenstein speaking to this other man, and that's how that story is framed. So it's essentially, for the most part, a story within a story, and fun fact, a section of this book is a story within a story within a story. And that particular section of the book is one of my favorite moments in fiction altogether. It happens over the course of the majority of Volume 2 of Frankenstein, especially the back half of Volume 2, if I'm remembering correctly. I'm not going to say what exactly happens in there, but it does deal a lot with Frankenstein's monster, and that section of the book is incredible. I loved that section a lot. Now, back to the framing mechanism. Yeah, it's a little bit strange. I can definitely see it being a little bit strange at first, but I do think it also comes back around on itself in the end quite beautifully and wraps up in a very fantastic way, because the story starts with these letters from the Arctic, and then the last bit of the story is also in the Arctic, following the conclusion of Victor's tale itself. And just the way that it wraps itself up, and this whole story is kind of contained in one setting, essentially because of that, by a technicality. I just really liked the way that it was framed. It was really neat to me when I read it. There was also some very great imagery in Frankenstein, as well as some very descriptive prose that worked a lot for me. I still remember the images of many of the scenes in this book as if I just read them. So, like I said, I don't remember a lot of the details per se, but I still remember a ton of the images from the scenes from while I was reading from a year ago, littered throughout the entire story, whether it be this opener, whether it be the end, whether it be several moments throughout, especially in Volume 2. Like I mentioned, I just really enjoyed most everything to do with Frankenstein. It just worked really well for me. I really enjoyed the writing as well, surprisingly readable despite the book being over 200 years old, flowed rather smoothly. As I did mention at the beginning of this video, or nearer to the beginning, I did read the 1818 version, and honestly, even if I do a reread or two of Frankenstein in the future, I don't think I'll ever read the revised edition, even though I specifically bought this version of the book because it contained both versions. I'm so attached already to what I read in the 1818 version that I'm not actually sure if I want to read an inherently different version, even if it's not too horribly different in most regards. Looking at comparisons, I'm just thinking like, I don't know, I think I just prefer to read the version that I already know I love so much. But with that all being said, all things that I really liked about Frankenstein, let's talk about the bad, because of course, this book has a little bit to say on this front, specifically in terms of the writing, which I did comment as being something that I really enjoyed. Let's start off with that, because that's something that I know a lot of people do have issues with, actually. Shelley says, a handful of words a lot. Like one of them specifically being wretched, or wretch. I guess there are a few other words like countenance and whatnot that Shelley uses quite frequently throughout the narrative. So much so to the point that if you look on Goodreads at 1-star reviews of Frankenstein, a good chunk of them are complaining about Shelley using the same words over and over. And I mean, fair enough if you don't like the repetition that much, or if you're really prone to noticing annoying repetition. Uh, sure, that can be something that will bother some people. I didn't actually notice it that much. I did notice with Wretch, but even so, it's just the time of 200 years ago. If anybody were to listen to any of the things that I'm saying right now, there are plenty of words that we say in the modern day a lot that, would people 200 years from now will surely find annoying. And that doesn't even get into stuff like Zoomer lingo, just in terms of normal English vocabulary. That's just kind of how things go. Some people also aren't in love with Shelley's prose, generally speaking, which I'm not personally sure how that could be. I was so entranced by the narrative and by the imagery and by everything that Shelley was writing about, because of her writing. So even though I see plenty of people complaining about this aspect of the book, I don't personally see it, but I did figure that I would bring it up anyway. Otherwise, I think the thing that most people dislike the most, uh, outside of the more technical regard, is they don't like the characterization of many of the characters, specifically the title character being Victor Frankenstein. A lot of people see him as kind of insufferable, and fair enough. But if we're being honest, that's actually kind of the point. And a lot of people also don't connect with the conflict of certain characters because they don't like the characterization or because they don't connect with the characters in any way, shape, or form. Again, I would argue that part of this is absolutely the point of the story, or at least thematically part of it makes up part of the thematic impact of the story. But like I said, all of that is kind of fair enough. If that's stuff that you don't like, that's stuff that you're just not going to like about the story, even though a lot of it focuses on some of those aspects. And in regards to the ugly, many people know Frankenstein because of pop culture, which is really cool in its way because Frankenstein's monster is such an iconic being in the pop culture. But it's also really unfortunate where this book is concerned because it's to the point that a lot of people still believe that the name Frankenstein is the name of the monster rather than the doctor who created the monster. That's how deep the pop culture thing goes. I would be surprised if there wasn't a good chunk of people, especially my age, who didn't even know that Frankenstein was a book before it was a universal monster flick. As such, being such a large part of the pop culture today, Frankenstein has a lot of preconceived notions associated with him, or rather, Frankenstein's monster does. In terms of Frankenstein himself, I guess you could say the same thing. Frankenstein is not a mad scientist per se. He's much more deplorable than that in the book. He's not just a mad scientist doing stuff for madness' sake. There's an aspect to that in his character in the book, but not nearly the way that he is depicted so briefly in any of the movie or TV or any form of film adaptation that features Victor Frankenstein. The monster isn't anything like he is depicted in film either. It's just a lot of things associated with that. The story as well is expected to be something it's not, similarly because of adaptations. Because of pop culture's preconceived notions of what Victor Frankenstein is and what the monster is, they're not entirely sure what the story is going to be of and why it's going to have any form of impact. So if you go into the book expecting for it to be, a essentially a precursor to the early Universal monster flicks, that's absolutely not what this book is. And again, that's kind of fine, but when you go into this book, you kind of have to go into it knowing what to expect. And even in that regard, another thing that I've seen people joke about in terms of Frankenstein is essentially the kind of joking complaint of the story is just a man creating another man, then he runs from his own responsibility, and then that created man does heinous stuff and then basically tries to negotiate that it wouldn't if it had an equal. That's essentially the gist of the story. And the most barren way possible. And really, the truth is that that is true. That is all absolutely true about what the story is. But to me, uh, the thematic resonance of all of that story is more important than the story itself. Even though I enjoyed the story itself, I think the undergirdle of all of that is a little bit more important than the actual substance of the story. When we come to the recommendation of whether I think you should read Frankenstein or not, it's a little bit complicated just in the sense that not everybody is going to love Frankenstein. It's relatively polarizing in the sense that a ton of people, if you don't click with Frankenstein, you're not going to like the book at all. But if it clicks for you, you adore the book. That's pretty much how it has been in my experience with many people who have read it. While I know a lot of people who despise this book, I know a lot more people who would actually agree with, or at least wouldn't argue with, Frankenstein being in somebody's all-time top 10. I think it's in my all-time top 10, and I know several other people who have it in their all-time top 10, because it just works for some people. My recommendation of Frankenstein is There's plenty of negative buzz around this particular classic, but it is really one you do have to read for yourself to form your own opinion. If you don't like it, you don't like it, and that's fine. I'm not going to blame anybody who doesn't like it. I mean, some of their reasons for not liking it I may not agree with, but that just seems to be the way that it is. But if you do enjoy Frankenstein, there's a good chance you really, really like the book. So, my recommendation is to at least give it a chance at some point to see if you are one of the people who loves it. Because if you are, you've just found one of your new favorite books all of a sudden. So that is my recommendation. And that is the end of my spoiler free review of Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. I haven't gotten very much work done, as I mentioned earlier, on revamping Count the Classics as I would like, as I've been focusing a bit more of my writing time on pre-writing the Reign of Ash sequence rather than working on video scripts. But that is fine. However, I would like to get back to those someday, and when slash if I do, I would like for that first video back in the series to be a newer, updated version of my first review of Frankenstein, but who knows, it may just be starting with Brave New World or something like that. We'll see if I even get around to ever working on those more again at any point in the future. I would like to, but that doesn't mean I will, as time has told. 2 videos of the Book Binge a week certainly goes a long way to making it harder to work on some of those extra videos because, I'm having to spend that much extra time thinking of video ideas as well as preparing and then recording and editing all of the videos. Takes a lot of production time. But with that all being said, thank you guys for watching this review of Frankenstein. I'll be back on Thursday for another video that's a little bit different than I've ever done. That is going to be more or less the first in a sort of type of series, I guess, that I would like to do over the next several months as I'm trying to continue to make videos come out on Thursdays when I don't necessarily have a whole lot of video ideas at the moment for Thursdays. With that all being said, like I said, again, thank you guys for watching. I'll be back again on Thursday for something a little bit different, and then I'll be back next week as well for my February reading wrap up and March TBR. So again, thank you guys for watching. I'll be back again in the next video.